Chapter 3. The Hooded Figure. It took Jaden days of exploring and a number of circles before he realized that the lights on the ceiling were placed in relation to the stars. When he asked Dago how the strange globes were made, an enigmatic smile was the only reply. The man was a kind host, and proved to be a wealth of knowledge concerning the history and everyday lives of the Drokka'lfar, as his people were called. But there were many questions that he simply chose not to answer. So Jaden looked to the walls. The home of Dago and his family was inside of a large rock column, one of many that stretched from floor to ceiling in Druania, the subterranean home of the Drokka'lfar. The pillar was at least 200 cubits high, and about 40 wide at its thickest points, with drawings or writing covering much of the surface. More homes were carved into its interior as it went up, extending all the way to the top. Dago claimed there were 30 dwellings, 5 communal areas, including 2 markets, and 172 residents in the structure which he affectionately referred to as Drokka'lfar, or Eagle's Nest. The first time Jaden saw one of the Drokka, a less formal name for the people, scaling the massive structure, he almost shouted for help before recognizing that it was the only way to the upper levels. There were no stairs or ladders. Even the Drokka children could shimmy up the vertical rock with ease, using nothing but the long claws on their hands in concert with the shorter ones on their feet. Someone would occasionally toss a long rope down with a basket attached to save an unnecessary climb, or when there was too much to carry in a pouch or satchel, so one did need to watch their head. He counted nearly 20 of the pillars, or pati, villages, as Dago referred to them, spread throughout the endless-seeming dome. Interspersed among them were an even larger number of stalactites and stalagmites that looked half-formed next to their larger cousins. That was only what he had seen of Druania so far. The images on the outside of the pillars were carved exclusively by the steel-hard claws of the Drokka, with as much skill as the relief inside Dago's home. The people's history, and what they knew of the outside world, was laid out in striking detail. Jaden did not understand half of it, but he managed to decipher from the images that they had once been part of a larger tribe. They had been given a great gift and were responsible for guarding it. Originally from the world above, they left behind all they knew to reside beneath the surface where their revered possession would be safe from any who coveted it. The ancient forest home they once inhabited, before the mass exodus, was depicted with lush vegetation and fruit-bearing trees, spread out endlessly beneath the image of the burning sun. He wondered if the knowledge of which Dago spoke was contained in these images. If so, it would take a lifetime to study it all. One colossal image, etched into a pati nearly twice as thick as Drokka'lfar, portrayed ancient Alamon's great tower in the lake, with Dagmar, a massive stronghold built into the cliff face of a nearby mountain where the Brotherhood of Mages kept their council, looming menacingly in the background. Another, that Jaden recognized instantly, sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. Hagmir Castle, which now belonged to Crysin, was outlined stark against the sky in the pale moonlight, an amazing feat considering the artist was working in stone. The fortress in the image was smaller, but the slender silhouette of the northern spire was unmistakable, as was Nightwind Pass, the narrow winding road that cut through solid rock beside it. Once a haven for weary travelers and merchant trains making the long trek between Crysin and the Central Kingdoms, Hagmir was now a dark place, filled with even darker beings. It was up there, somewhere, not far above them. Scars from the gashes on his stomach would have been painful reminders of his time in that fortress, except they were no more than long, thin scabs now, thanks to the sticky plant that Dago called Drokka'lfar, or Tears of the Air. Dago's wife, Fiega, took great care in reapplying the salve when it began to dry out, fussing over him in her own language. It was a mothering tone that he took to be half chastisement and half prayer. As quickly as his wounds were healing, he would say that the prayers were working. There was a sort of deep, natural magic about the Drokka'lfar that he could not quite put his finger on. Fiega was currently seated on a bed of thick grass beside a slow-moving stream, passing baked fish, tubers, grilled mushrooms, and fruit out on clay plates for lunch. A doe and her spotted fawns had meandered into the center of the little picnic and were sniffing at the strange food as if trying to decide if it was edible. Jaden sat between Dago and Zaria, the couple's daughter. He accepted the food politely, trying his best to avoid the younger girl's eyes, which always seemed to be following him. A sudden thought occurred to him as he inhaled the savory aroma. "How do the plants grow without sunlight?" he asked, causing Dago to look instinctively to the ceiling where the spheres continued their constant radiance. "Is it the globes?" Dago fidgeted and flashed his smile again, a sure indication that he would not speak on the matter. The globes were always a touchy subject. Though his host's close-mouthed nature was occasionally tiresome, Dago's willingness to let him explore and learn what he could on his own more than made up for it. He was also the only Drok'a in Drokka'lfar who could speak the common tongue of the nations, something he claimed he had picked up from a traveler who had come to Druania long ago. His knowledge of the language, and the proximity of his home to the ground, were two reasons the soft-spoken Drok'a had ended up with him for a houseguest. Another was that he was an important and trusted member of the community. The ground floor of the pati was typically reserved for the most skilled craftsperson and their family. Of all the sculptors who lived there, Dago was the only one allowed to work in crystal, the most cherished commodity in Druania. A small group from Drokka'lfar had been mining the precious mineral when they found Jaden unconscious in a distant shaft. Not knowing what to do, they turned to their Da'aromo, something like a mayor, for direction, as they did with the majority of their problems and disputes. Dago had graciously accepted the curious stranger into his own home, solving the problem. Jaden's rescuers had stopped by with their family shortly after he awoke the first day, bringing words of encouragement translated by Dago. A stream of curious villagers followed. Everyone was extremely polite, going out of their way to make him feel comfortable. They offered him everything from food to examples of their handiwork. The latter he regretfully declined, having no way to carry it. Commerce within the community, he quickly learned, was based on a system of trade that took advantage of the special abilities of each member. Everyone had their own unique way of contributing to the whole, whether through farming, fishing, mining, or crafting the necessities of everyday living. 2 women from a nearby village had visited that very morning, trading with Dago for a pair of crystal figurines. They left behind a large supply of flour and extra blankets for the new guest. "Fish is good?" Dago asked. "Yes, very good," he replied truthfully. "Thank you. The mushrooms, too. They are delicious." Dago passed the compliment along to Fiega, who beamed with pride. While dinner among the Drokka'lfar was a community event, featuring music, storytelling, and often visitors from nearby villages, lunch tended to be more casual. The stream by which they picnicked now was the main artery that ran through the underground land. It was filled with a variety of fish that spent most of their lives in a large lake that made up much of Druania, traveling a short distance upstream year-round to spawn. A small raft piled high with wicker baskets passed slowly by, propelled upstream by 4 men with long wooden poles. The Drok'a paused in their labor to wave, not appearing the least bit surprised to see Jaden. Word of his coming had quickly spread beyond the boundaries of the pati. As much as he was enjoying his newfound freedom and getting to know the locals, he could not help but feel a pang of guilt when he thought of Crysin. Here he was, sitting comfortably by a meandering stream, eating mushrooms, while his people suffered. Suddenly, the meal did not sit so well. "Are you for walk?" Dago asked hopefully. Druanians spent much of their free time observing the many species of deer, birds, and large colorful bats indigenous to the caverns, or simply admiring the beauty of their own handiwork. They could often tell which artist had created a specific carving by the style and form of the image. "I guess so." While the carvings and the magnificent gardens they had cultivated were all well and good, even they could not improve his spirits when thoughts of home surfaced. "I must leave Druania soon," he told Dago. The Drok'a was caught off guard by the statement. He looked to his wife for help, but she had not understood and smiled as if nothing had been said. A strange look came across his face, almost as if he were afraid. "You walk with Zaria today? Tomorrow we talk about this thing?" While he did not relish another long, uncomfortable walk with the Droka girl, he was not a bug. Politeness won out, and he soon found himself hiking through the indoor wilderness under her intense, blue-eyed scrutiny. The air was clean, permeated with the earthy scent of mineral-heavy water mixing with the soil. A warm mist began to rise, until it was swimming through the trees and rock pillars like a rolling sea. Combined with the green glow, it gave the place a surreal, fairy-like feel. He smiled woodenly at a young couple that passed, holding hands and gazing longingly into each other's eyes. Something about the Drokka'lfar tugged at the back of his memory. As foreign as they were to him, they reminded him of home in a curious way. Druania tried to lead the way, as always, but he refused to follow out of sheer stubbornness, striking off in a direction he had not yet been. The lean, dark-skinned girl had no choice but to follow or be separated. A weight had begun to grow on his shoulders. He should be doing something. His people needed him, and the more time he spent here, the less he could do to ensure they had a future. After a few hours of quiet walking, a roar started to build, and they soon came to a waterfall that began somewhere near the ceiling. At the base, beyond the cascading curtain of falling water, a natural cave was visible, yawning open like a great maw. The cave pulled at him. His pulse quickened, and a tingling sensation raged through his blood as he continued forward. Dimly aware of a sound behind him, he turned in annoyance to see that Druania had stopped following. She stood perfectly still, her eyes no longer probing, but pleading. Shaking her head, she spoke frantically in her own language. What did she want now? He did not have time for foolishness. Ignoring her, he turned his attention back to the cave. The desire to go on was overwhelming. He began to pant as he approached the sand-strewn opening. Something deep inside had awoken, and it tugged at him on a primal level. Spray from the waterfall struck him as he neared the cave, the cold sensation serving only to focus him on his goal. He fed on the feeling, moving onward with a sense of urgency. Druania began to shout. Two dark figures suddenly dropped from the concealment of the rocky cliff face, blocking his path. They were male Droka, barefoot and shirtless, with pants cut just below the knee. Their claws were spread wide in front of them, looking ready to do much more than sculpt rock. Growling a curse, he tried to sidestep the pair, but they moved to block him with more speed than he had given them credit for. Jumping back quickly, he balanced his weight, readying himself. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. He was trained in combat by General Eckenroy Carthaginian himself. There was no going back. The man on the left was the taller of the two, and carried himself with the most authority. He nodded to his companion, and they began to circle. Jaden knew exactly what they were doing. They were waiting until he was unable to see them both at the same time, and then they would make their move. Following the tall man with his eyes, he let the other out of his vision momentarily. Turning back just in time, he caught the shorter man's arm as he lunged, augmenting the Droka's own momentum to fling him forward into his comrade. He expected a collision, but to his dismay the pair easily avoided contact and moved gracefully back into a ready position. What was more disheartening was that the smaller Droka had not even tried to use his greatest weapon, his claws. They were playing with him. If he had a sword, he would stand a chance, but hand-to-hand they were obviously much too skilled. It was time to switch tactics. Lunging toward the opening, he went to the ground on one knee, pretending to slip. When the pair moved in to grab him, he flung his hands up and threw sand in their faces. They reeled back, and he used the opportunity to make a dash for the cave. The water was exhilarating as he passed through it. He had not felt so alive since his capture, maybe even before. A small warning sounded somewhere in the back of his mind, cautioning that all was not as it should be, but he ignored it. At a full sprint, he ran down a tunnel with a sandy floor, the walls lined with the green globes he had become familiar with. Every step took him closer to his goal. There was a powerful presence pulsing through the very rock, familiar yet alien at the same time, like the Drokka'lfar. Somehow, He was sure that whatever lay at the end of the cave would give him the strength he needed to set things right and regain his kingdom. The glow from the Drokka'lfar lamps intensified. He stumbled into a round chamber and had to shield his eyes against the brightest glow he had seen yet, emanating from an object at the very center. A hooded figure stood between him and his prize, but nothing could stop him now. Snarling like a beast, he lunged. One robed arm rose calmly, and he heard a soft whisper. The ensuing concussion deafened him. It was as if the air had solidified, throwing him backwards where he landed in an awkward heap. He tried to rise, but his limbs felt like jelly. On hands and knees, he crawled back toward the center of the chamber. If only he could reach the light. Clawed hands grabbed his ankles, dragging him back. He was subsequently picked up and tossed unceremoniously over a man's shoulder. It was a long trek back to Drokka'lfar. The globes in the cavernous realm had begun to dim, as they always did near dusk in the outside world. Eventually, they would become nothing more than a dull glow, before brightening again to simulate the sunrise. His back hurt, and he still could not hear clearly, but a fog had begun to lift from his mind. Gradually, his eyes grew wider and wider in horror at his reprehensible actions. He was quite sure that his transgressions had violated any number of Druania's codes of conduct, whatever they might be. Would he be punished, or merely sent away? It was time to leave, past time, but he did not wish to part on bad terms after the hospitality they had shown him. When they reached Dago's home, the Drok'a who was carrying him, the tall man from the cave, laid him on his bed. He could hear voices spoken in hushed tones. The hooded figure was talking to Dago, who wrung his hands and gestured with his shoulders apologetically. Jaden searched for a glimpse of skin beneath the hood, but saw none. Finally, the figure tilted their head his way, the dark visor studying, then turned and left.